Hello and welcome everyone to the Intrepid Museum's live virtual programming. Thank you so much for joining us for this Intrepid Highlights tour today. We're so happy that you all are here. And if you have any questions as we go through everything, you can feel free to put them in the chat. So my name is Alicia, and I'm an educator at the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum in New York City. And I'll be your host today for the program. And just as a reminder, the museum's live streams are free. And if you'd like to support us in delivering this new content, please do click on the link in the comments or in the description below. So feel free to use the chat today to say hello. Maybe let us know where you're tuning in from. Let us know maybe if you've ever been to the Intrepid Museum before. And of course, if you do have any questions, you can pop them in there too. So once again, I'm Alicia, and I'm an educator at the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum, where our mission is to honor our heroes, educate the public, and inspire our youth. And today, we are going to get a glimpse into our museum and some of the really cool things that make us special. So for those of you who may not be familiar, this is the Intrepid Museum. So our complex is located on the west side of Manhattan on the Hudson River, and our museum is actually housed inside of a historic World War II aircraft carrier, the USS Intrepid. Now, on site, we also do have some other cool things. We have a historic Cold War era submarine. We've got the Space Shuttle Enterprise and also a British Airways Concorde, which I'll tell you a little bit more about later. And as you can see in this picture here, yeah, our ship is really, really big. So it is actually 913 feet long. Now, that is so big that if you stood it up on its end, it would be actually taller than a lot of New York City skyscrapers. And it's also so long that you could play 3 games of football on top at the very same time. Now, it was constructed way back in 1943 for a very specific purpose. It was made during a time when, we were fighting these countries overseas, all the way across oceans, and we didn't want to have to launch our planes over here in America and then fly them way over across the water to get there, because that would just take too much fuel and too much time. So we created these aircraft carriers, just like the Intrepid, to help us out. Now, something else that I do like to point out is a little bit about the history of how the ship was made. So the keel of our ship, the very bottom of it, was actually laid in Newport News, Virginia on December 1st, 1941, in preparation for World War II. And just 6 days later, on December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor was attacked. Of course, a day that will live in infamy. Now, this dragged the United States into the conflict. It also dragged a number of our male shipyard workers into it as well, into the war. And so about 400 women were then called in to temporarily fill some of those positions to keep up with all the wartime needs. And you can actually see a few when you come to see the ship. We've got some pictures that will actually really bring to life that whole circumstance where we were building the ship and passing it on to the Navy. Now, our ship, again, was in service from 1943 to 1974. It later became a museum in 1982 after we saved it from the scrapyard. But one of the best things that we are known for is some of the amazing aircraft that we have on board. Now, to start, our oldest plane, and maybe one of the most popular, certainly one of my favorites, is this one right here. So this is the Avenger. Now, this plane is from World War II, around the same time that the Intrepid was constructed, and it was built by the Grumman Aircraft Corporation out on Long Island. Now, a number of these planes flew off of the Intrepid throughout World War II, but when people first step onto the ship and, they see this giant blue plane looming in front of them, often they do have a reaction, and more often than not is one of confusion. So take a look at this plane. You also might have that reaction. You might be like, hey, Alicia, I hate to tell you this, but your plane looks a little broken. Yes, you might have noticed that the wings on this plane look a little unusual. Maybe not quite the way that you would expect to see them on an airplane. Usually, airplanes that we see maybe at an airport have their wings extended out to the side. But can anyone tell me in the chat why these wings might be like this? A little unusual. Maybe it actually is broken. Or maybe you have also seen birds tuck their wings back when they dive down, or even just when they're sitting there, they have their wings folded back. So we, as a museum, could, of course, intentionally display our airplanes broken. Often our aircraft restoration specialists do things like to keep some of the authenticity in the machines. Sometimes they'll leave a surface that's a little unrestored or displayed, a certain way in order to highlight something. So we could be recreating a scene here where they're doing a broken repair, something like that in the hangar there. But the real reason why these planes have wings that fold like that is to save space on the ship. And yes, Doyle, I see your comment. Save space on the aircraft carriers. Exactly. So everyone, if you were to put your arms out to the side like an airplane and maybe rotate around, you'd probably realize you'd be bumping into some things, right? You're going to take up a lot of space. But if you put them in a little bit, or you put them back behind you, well, you're going to be a little bit narrower. So same idea with these planes. By doing this, you can fit more of them inside of a small space, just like the area that you can see here. This is the hangar deck. So this is where they would store a whole lot of the planes. You can kind of think of it like a garage, maybe. And during World War II, they would actually store about 80 to 100 of these really big planes on the ship between the hangar deck and also up on the flight deck too. Now, something else you might notice about this plane is the color. You might notice actually that there are 3 main colors on this plane. And believe it or not, this is actually a type of sea camouflage. So it's a way for the plane to blend in while it's flying. And you can imagine if you're down on a ship and you're looking up, you are going to see that white underbelly. So that might help it to blend in a little bit with the clouds. And from right alongside it, if you're flying next to it, you're going to see the light blue, kind of like the sky surrounding you. But then, of course, if you're above it and you're looking down, you are going to see that darker blue, and it's going to blend in with what's underneath you out at sea, which is the ocean. So it's a form of something called countershade. And it's also something we can see in nature on animals. So you can think of things like sharks or penguins even, how they have the darker back and the lighter bellies. So same idea here. So the Avenger is pretty big and clunky. Yes, and you might have noticed that it's got this fan thing in front of it as well. Now that is something called a propeller, of course. Planes back during that era in World War II, and actually some still today, they used propellers to move through the air. And as a result, they weren't super fast compared to some of the planes that we have today. At max speed, this Avenger could actually go about 276 miles per hour. So yeah, it's fast, but certainly not as fast as some of the jet planes that we had later that we'll look at too. And it actually also shared a nickname, this plane did, with a famous Thanksgiving meal. So can anyone guess maybe what that was called? It's a bird. It's kind of a big and awkward, clunky bird when it tries to fly, which is also how the Avenger also kind of flew too. So they decided to nickname it the turkey. Yep, because it does kind of look like a turkey with its wings folded back and again, just kind of a little awkward when it flew. Really big. Now, incidentally, other things do use propellers to move, for instance, ships. And so on the right here, you can see one of the 4 propellers that were on the Intrepid. So that helped it to move through the water as well. Now, you also might have noticed underneath the plane, there's this giant bomb here. And so this is actually a torpedo bomb. The Avenger was a torpedo bomber. And this massive torpedo weighed 2,000 pounds. So the Avenger would fly really low and slow towards enemy ships. Then it would drop this massive torpedo into the water and then very quickly try to fly away to get out of there. And then the torpedo would keep on cruising right ahead and hopefully sink the enemy ship. So that is a very important thing for the bombers to have as well. Those torpedoes that speed on through the water. Now, everyone, here's another type of plane. This is a Cold War era plane. So this came after World War II. And this is called a jet plane. This one in particular is called the Fury. And so this plane was flown by 21 carrier-based fighter squadrons, including one that was assigned to the Intrepid in 1957. And it was actually one of the first aircraft that was designed specifically for aircraft carriers. So you might notice, again, it's got those folded wings in order to save space. It's a little smaller than the Avenger for sure. But you also might notice it looks a little bit different because it doesn't have that propeller on the front like the Avenger did. And that's because jet planes move a little bit differently. So everyone, I want you to try something for me. Everyone take a deep breath in. And then I want you to let it out again. There you go. So you just became a jet plane. That is how jet planes work. They take a deep breath in the front, they compress it, they mix it up with some jet fuel, then they set it on fire, they ignite it, and it shoots out the back. And there you go. As you can imagine, just like a rocket, it's going to help you go much, much faster. So they do move much faster than planes like the Avenger, propeller planes. In fact, the Fury's top speed was 681 miles per hour. So that is more than twice as fast as the Avenger. But we still, of course, see, again, those folded wings in order to save space. So still a carrier airplane, and in fact, designed specifically for aircraft carriers. Now, remember though, I told you that we used to launch and land planes off of the Intrepid. And remember, I also told you it's only 913 feet long. Now, that is pretty tall, of course, again, about as tall as a skyscraper. But the launch and the landing areas on the flight deck there are only about 250 feet long. So a lot shorter. And to give you some perspective, runways at airports are typically much, much, much longer than that. For example, here in New York City, JFK Airport's longest runway is over 14,000 feet long. So very, very, very long. And airplanes, of course, need to be able to build up speed and thrust to generate the lift that they need to take off. They need all of that runway space. So in order for planes on the Intrepid to do that, to take off safely and to land safely too, they have to build up those speeds, and they have to do it very quickly. So that is where they would use something called steam catapults. They would get shot off the front of their ship, kind of like a big slingshot, and it would help them to build up speed so much quicker by having it that way. Now, inside of the ship, one of the first things that you actually would see when you come in are these things all along the walls. So you're going to see these giant metal canisters and these pipes that are built into the ship on the sides. And these are things called steam accumulators. They help to build up all of that steam that is being generated from the ship's engine. And all of that steam is going to really add up, going to build up a lot of pressure so that eventually it can be fed up to the flight deck to help power those catapults, those slingshots. Because again, the way that those work is all that tension, and then pop, there it goes to launch them off. So we've got pistons up there that are moving thanks to all of this steam pressure and the steam accumulators. So in a wartime situation, these planes have to be ready to go at a moment's notice. You know, these pilots would often get to their plane, they get ready to go, they'd get hitched onto this catapult and then shot into the sky in as fast as 7 minutes. So really, really fast here. And you can actually see a track along the bottom of this picture there where the planes would attach onto that catapult track, and then it would shoot forward to launch it off the ship. And it could go 0 to 150 miles per hour in just 2 seconds. So that is the fastest roller coaster you will ever ride. You can imagine what that's going to feel like. Permanent facelift. Now, landing is just as difficult too, because again, we don't have a long runway to come in and slowly land and be all comfortable. So they had to do something a little bit different for landing also. They had to use something called a tail hook. Now, here's a picture of one on the back of one of our planes. This is the back of the tracer. So you can see that black and white striped hook-shaped thing there. It's kind of like a black and white candy cane, maybe. It's circled in red on your screen there. And this tail hook would drop down, and it would snag onto one of 5 cables that would be draped across the flight deck. And it would slow you down from, 150 miles an hour to 0 miles an hour in just 2 seconds. So the opposite of our takeoff. So again, that's going to be basically a controlled crash landing there, but it would be able to get you to land safely on a very short runway there too. So it's just kind of like you were playing Red Rover maybe, and you got stopped, only a lot faster and a lot harder. So here you can see a plane that's coming in for a landing. On the left, you can see hanging down there is that tail hook. It's highlighted by that red arrow there. And then on the right, you can see the cable, or one of those cables, that would be there for it to catch onto and stop it and slow it down there. So another successful landing that we see here, albeit again, quite an abrupt one. And these operations were so fine-tuned that the crew could launch 2 aircraft and land 1 every 50 seconds. So again, a very well-oiled machine on board the Intrepid there. So I want to pause here before we move on for some more highlights and see if we have any questions. Any questions at all? Are Avengers still flown in the Navy today? No, actually. So Avengers entered the service in 1942 during World War II, and they were used until the 1960s. But at that point, we had better technology. We had jet planes like the Fury that moved much, much faster. They were also a little bit smaller, so better suited to the nature of combat and being out at sea. And a lot of the Avengers ended up being scrapped or just sold off. And many of them eventually became used for like pesticides. They would load it up, heavy tanks inside, and can carry a lot of load there. So they would actually go over fields. They would drop water. Or they would drop pesticides out into fields because they were really good for that purpose. They go low and slow. So a lot of them were saved for that. A lot of them also, have been used in private collections for people who do, reenactments and things like that. But no, the Navy no longer uses Avengers, unfortunately, in their service. All right. Any other questions? Oh, what happens if a plane misses the landing cable? Yes, so that's very important. They used to actually have for the larger planes, the Avenger. They used to actually have like a giant, kind of like a net that it would eventually be able to crash into, and the propellers would get all caught into this net. Kind of like a gill net, I guess. Like a fish might get caught in. So they would be able to catch it that way. But with the jet planes, they're going a whole lot faster. So with that, they actually redesigned the flight deck. They originally it was just one big rectangle, but with the jet planes, they took the landing section of it and they put it just slightly off kilter. So when they're coming in at a slight angle. So if they miss 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 cables, then what they're supposed to do is as they're coming in for the landing, they're supposed to gun their engines just in case. And in the event that they miss them all, they're ready. They still have a lot of speed and they can just go right back up and come around and try again. So that is something that they would call a bolter. They have to bolt away from there real fast and hook around and try again. So very, very dangerous. Of course, we don't want our planes to be crashing into, the other planes that are all there too. All right. So everyone, moving on from here then. Earlier, I mentioned that the Fury was around during the Cold War. So what was that? Well, the Cold War was a time when the United States was in a war of ideas. It wasn't a hot war with guns and bombs and things. Rather, we were competing with the Soviet Union or modern day Russia over ideas and who everyone should follow. And, one way that they could do this was to show off technology. And so they wanted to say who had the best technology. And one of the things that they were testing out technologically was going into space. So this piece of machinery that we have here, a replica of it in our flight deck or in our hangar deck rather, this is a space capsule. So we are looking at this big, almost like light bulb shaped thing that says United States on it. It's got a flag. And some people say it even kind of looks like an ice cream cone, tilted on its side. But it's a very special vehicle. This space capsule is a type of spacecraft. It would ride up on top of a rocket. So, of course, the rockets are those big things with all the flames coming out the bottom to get you up into space. But when it gets into space, it would separate from the rocket. And then they would continue to orbit around the planet. So in the 1960s, we're in this Cold War era, NASA was part of something called the space race, again, with Soviet Union, this competition. And what the finish line was to get to the moon. They wanted to be the first to get people to the moon and then come back home safely. So, of course, you don't just roll out of bed and end up on the moon. There are a few baby steps you have to take. You have to figure out how to make your rocket, first of all, how to launch your rocket, how to, get up into space and then breathe up there, and how to sleep and eat and work over long periods of time. And then, of course, there's things like docking and landing and how to get back home and all of these things. So it's a little more complicated than just boom, there you are. So these capsules were part of those baby early steps, right? This was called Project Mercury. And this was really just to see if people could even reach outer space in the first place and survive up there for a while. And this replica is of a capsule called the Mercury Aurora 7. And you can probably tell just by looking at it that, yeah, it's not very big, right? In fact, it only held one astronaut inside of it. So in 1962, the astronaut who went in this capsule was named Scott Carpenter. And there he is on the left, and there is his Mercury Atlas rocket on the right. And his capsule is that little tiny triangle on the very top. So Scott Carpenter was actually only up in outer space for about 5 hours. He did 3 orbits around the Earth, and then eventually he very safely splashed back down into the Atlantic Ocean. They figured, water would be a nice kind of softer landing surface than on hard land in the desert or something. But if someone is, going to be landing in the ocean, the middle of nowhere, well, NASA obviously has to go pick them up again, right? You can't just leave your astronaut stranded out in the middle of the ocean there. So they sent a helicopter to rescue him. But when they got to the place where they thought he was supposed to be, they couldn't find him anywhere, and they panicked. And this was all because while he was wrapping up his mission, Scott Carpenter had gotten a little bit distracted by one of his experiments, and he ended up firing his reentry thrusters just about 2 seconds too late. And now you can imagine, of course, you are up there orbiting the Earth. You're going really, really fast. So 2 seconds, it really adds up. And as a result, he ended up coming back in, and he ended up splashing down into the water about 200 miles off course. So he was there, but he was a little bit out of the way there. Well, fortunately, eventually they were able to track him down, and he was fine. He was just hanging out there sunbathing. So they picked him up and they flew him to the closest airport that was floating in the water, which, of course, just happened to be the Intrepid. So here he is on board the ship. Here's some pictures from our collection. And there he is surrounded by officers and onlookers on board the Intrepid after he was picked up in his capsule in 1962. So a very, very momentous occasion. And of course, that really slick early, Mercury era spacesuit that he's wearing there as well, with the zippers and everything. I do love that spacesuit. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the reason why we are a space museum as well. A lot of people wonder, okay, they think, okay, you're a sea museum. I get it. You're a ship. You're an air museum. You got airplanes. Space museum. What? Well, this is why. The Intrepid played a really important role in retrieving astronauts and their capsules after they returned from outer space. But that was Mercury. Again, the baby phase of NASA. We were just learning how to do the earliest things. We were just learning how to breathe and effectively eat baby food up there in space, right? But after the Mercury missions, there came the Gemini missions. So these were named Gemini after the constellation Gemini, the twins, because it was the first time that NASA sent 2 people up into space together inside of the capsule. So it was a little bit bigger than the Mercury capsule that we just looked at. And on board Gemini 3, we had these 2 guys. It was John Young and Gus Grissom. So these 2 astronauts went into outer space. They also orbited around the planet 3 times. And then, of course, they splashed down into the Atlantic Ocean. Here's a picture of the Intrepid actually retrieving the capsule from the ocean in 1965. You can see that yellow kind of floaty around it to make sure it doesn't sink. But this mission also has kind of a funny story associated with it that we do like to tell. Now, I mentioned earlier that these missions had a lot of experiments going on. So you can kind of equate this phase to like being a toddler. There were a number of tests they were doing. And now toddlers don't do this stuff, obviously, but they kind of test things out a little bit. So these tests were things like looking at solar flares and color visibility and making a lot of observations. But they were also experimenting with the human body in space for longer periods of time. And so now we were actually also kind of taking our first steps outside of a spacecraft, doing some early extravehicular activity or EVAs. And we were also, making friends for the first time. We were docking with another spacecraft while in orbit with the Agena target vehicle, which was a rocket booster that allowed us to get a little bit further away from the Earth to see it a little bit better in space. And also on this particular mission, they were testing out something else. They were testing out more solid space food, just like how a toddler's palate might begin to grow a little bit as they get older. Now, I don't know if anyone knows anything about space food. A lot of people think of stuff like, astronaut ice cream, that freeze-dried, crumbly stuff, which was actually never used in space. But early astronaut food was really more like baby food. In fact, John Glenn had the first food in space, and it was effectively applesauce in a toothpaste tube with a straw poking out of it. So not very appetizing, but of course they had to just make sure that you could actually eat, because who knows what your digestion would do, or your esophagus or something. So that went okay. So then the food morphed into these like dehydrated powders and these cubes that were covered in this clear goo to keep it all together in these little plastic pouches. And now in the Gemini missions, they were trying out slightly harder, different food. So this is what it looked like. This food right here, on the left, we've got some dehydrated beef pot roast. In the center, there is some orange juice in a plastic pouch. And down on the right, there are cubes of toasted bread and dehydrated bacon and egg bites. Yum! A perfect balanced breakfast, everyone. Now, you might also notice there's hands on the top left. They are injecting water into the pot roast to reconstitute it. So it's adding liquid to it to make it more edible. Ugh. Yeah, so that's because NASA quickly realized that all of the water that you can find in our everyday foods that we eat, it takes up a lot of extra weight. And they realized that it would be easier to just go ahead and add the water once they got up there, since it was already being produced on board as a byproduct of the fuel cell operation. Of course, they don't really mention that they didn't have hot water yet, and it kind of tasted like gasoline as well. So, oh well, they were still experimenting. Now, there is a really great story, though, that we like to tell about this particular mission, Gemini 3, right? So, right before the launch, as a joke, another astronaut had handed John Young, one of the astronauts, a corned beef sandwich as a joke. Because, well, of course, the food that he's supposed to be eating up there, as you can see, didn't really look too appetizing. Well, John Young snuck the sandwich into a pocket of his spacesuit and he went about his business. And then he got up into space and he pulled it out. And so he handed it to Gus and they both started eating it, the first corned beef sandwich in space. Now, here on Earth, that might not be too much of a problem. You can eat a sandwich fine, throw away the evidence, maybe, sweep your crumbs down the floor, your dog can eat it, whatever. But in space, things happen a little differently, things are a little strange up there. It's a bad idea, maybe even a dangerous one, to bring something like a corned beef sandwich into outer space because of microgravity. Now, as soon as they started to eat the sandwich, of course, they began to notice the effects of the microgravity. The crumbs from the bread started to float up and all around the capsule. And of course, those crumbs could have gotten into their systems or into their eyes, or they could have even inhaled them somehow. And well, everyone, nothing messes with reentry like hacking on a piece of rye bread. Am I right? So they quickly put it away. But NASA had heard every word of their conversation and they got in a lot of trouble. So they had to publicly apologize to Congress for possibly jeopardizing the mission. But believe it or not, it's actually now for this reason that if astronauts want to eat a sandwich in space, they can't use bread. They have to use tortillas because tortillas are flat packed and they don't make crumbs. So there you go. The more you know. And also, speaking of crumbs, something else really fun is that the Intrepid crew loved cake. They would make these massive, massive cakes to celebrate all sorts of special occasions and anniversaries. So here are Gus Grissom and John Young with their welcome back to Earth cake on board the Intrepid. And of course, if you have a really, really big cake, you need a really, really big knife to cut it. So there they are cutting with some military sabers, some swords, cutting some slices to celebrate their cake there. We have a really great exhibit currently on display at the Intrepid called Navy Cakes, which you can come check out. It's all about these massive, massive cakes. And in fact, we actually have a replica of the 25th anniversary cake, and it's huge. And there's a sword in that one too. So I want to pause here again and see if we have any other questions. Any other questions before we move on? All right, why is it called Project Mercury? Right, so, you might have heard of Mercury before. Mercury is the name of one of the planets in our solar system. And it and many of the other planets, of course, in space missions got their name from Roman mythology. So Mercury was the messenger god, kind of, I guess you could say like their mailman, and known for being really, really, really fast. He had wings on his helmet and on his shoes and on his little wand, and supposedly it made him go super, super fast. But Mercury is also both the first planet from the sun and also very fast too. So as the name might suggest, it's the fastest, it's the first. And so 1 year on Mercury actually only takes about 88 days. While it takes us 365 days here, of course, to go around the sun. So they named it Mercury because, again, going back to the idea of the space race, America wanted to be the first, so first planet, first to the moon, and then also the fastest to get to the moon. So the fastest planet as Mercury as well. So again, Gemini later was named after the constellation, the Gemini twins there. And so they thought the idea of the two would make a lot of sense. So it's symbolic. That's why they named it that. All right. Any other questions? No? All right. So moving on from here, we talked about some capsules, the Mercury and Gemini capsules. And of course, after that was Apollo, the ones that went to the moon, our finish line for the space race. But then afterwards, NASA decided to go, rather than go even further, they decided to stay home a little bit closer and start to build out some other things a little bit closer to Earth, but that we could see further out. So that led us to this. So this right here, everyone, is the Space Shuttle Enterprise. It is a prototype orbiter shuttle. And so that's what we did here. We built these larger things in order to help us to bring larger pieces of equipment up, things like the Hubble Space Telescope and other satellites. Now, this is actually one of my favorite things here at the Intrepid Museum. It's up on the flight deck of the Intrepid, the shuttle pavilion up there. But I'm going to tell you a really deep, dark secret about this particular space shuttle. This space shuttle never went into space. It's true. Not many people know that, but we do still love it, of course. This was, as I mentioned, a prototype. This was a testing vehicle, and they needed, of course, to see if something this massive could even work. The whole point of it is that it would go up on the rocket and then glide through the atmosphere with its airplane-like design in order to then land on a runway, just like an airplane. Because remember, before, those capsules were just one-time use. They landed in the ocean and they were retrieved and then, put into museums eventually. But with this one, NASA could reuse it over and over and over again. So it'd be saving a lot of money and a lot of time to do it that way. So they really had to strike this balance of being able to make it still land safely. This one, as you can see, is much, much bigger. It had more than two people. It actually could hold 7 or 8 astronauts inside of it at a time, but also needed to be big enough to bring those things into outer space in its payload bed. Now, the majority of the shuttle is actually empty. It's kind of like the trunk of a car or the back of like a big cargo truck. And the area that was used to bring up those things, these big, heavy pieces of equipment, things like the International Space Station, they put it together in pieces, or things like Hubble. But it was the orbiter's job in order to put these things up into space so that we can learn more. Now, the Enterprise did not go into outer space. That is true, but it did at least get up into the sky. And these are some photos of an actual test flight that it did. Now, normally when these things go up, as I mentioned, it's attached to a rocket. It's going up with flames and it's going up really, really fast. But it didn't use a rocket during these testing procedures. Instead, it got a piggyback ride from a 747 airplane. Now, back in 1977, this jet lumbered down the runway and it eventually took off with this space shuttle just hanging out on its back. It went up to 26,000 feet. It was going, I think, just under about 500 miles an hour, which for a space shuttle is really not that fast, and it's not really that high either. But then once it got up there, just separated and it effectively dropped it. And so then it used banking turns. There's this glider now, and it ended up landing just like an airplane at a runway or an airport. So after NASA was satisfied with these tests, there it is landing. Again, it just, glided around until it finally found its way in. After NASA was happy with how everything went, they made a few other changes, and then they created 5 other orbiters that were used to go into space. Now, in 2011, though, NASA retired the Space Shuttle program. So we don't actually use them anymore. There are a few that are still around in museums. There's one in Florida, one in DC, one in California. Of course, we are very lucky to have one here in New York City as well. But they retired the shuttle program for a few different reasons. And now they actually started using capsules again. So at this time, we were actually using things called the Soyuz capsules. And this is one that we have in the shuttle pavilion. And this one has actually been into outer space. You can actually see right at the top of it, it's a little bit lighter. It's a little bit scorched on re-entry. It gets real hot coming in through that atmosphere. So there's some burn marks on it, which is kind of cool. But this is what astronauts would use to go into outer space after shuttles. So these capsules were sent up by Russia, and until recently, they basically sold seats to the United States to get up to the International Space Station. And I always think that's kind of interesting, and kind of ironic that originally we were in this Cold War with Russia, the Soviet Union, right? And now here we are working hand in hand with them in order to achieve great things in space. So, the way that these Soyuz capsules would work, kind of similar to the Apollo capsule, actually. Three astronauts would go up in the rocket into space in this thing. And what's really interesting about these is that they don't land in water like our earliest capsules. These ones landed in the desert in Kazakhstan. So, you'd think that'd be a very, very hard, rough landing there. It does have extra parachutes that come out to help to slow it down. But also, what's interesting, you see that picture on the right, it looks like it's a real bad crash landing. But what's happening in that picture is that there are explosives on the bottom of the capsule that actually explode outward and downward to give it a last minute boost when it's coming in for that landing. So it can really, recapture that drag and slow it down even more. So I would still imagine the landings are really, really rough on that still. You're still landing in the desert. You're still landing on solid earth, not the water. So you can see in that picture on the left, they've got lots of padding around them, lots of, inflatable, soft, squishy stuff to help them when they land. It's still a bumpy landing. So anyway, the museum, back to the Enterprise, got the Enterprise rather. We were awarded this wonderful spacecraft back in 2012, and we were so excited when we got it that we decided to celebrate it in a way that it all began on the back of a 747 jet, doing a victory lap around Manhattan. So really love this picture here. If you see on the top there, you've got the Enterprise hitched to the back of that plane. And then directly underneath it, you can actually see an aerial view of our museum out on the Hudson. It's got that angled runway. Of course, you can see there too that I mentioned for the jet planes. And right to the left of it is the Concorde, which I will get to in just a moment. But if you've ever visited our museum, you will know that we also have a bunch of other neat planes out there on our flight deck that you can kind of see as little dots in this aerial view here. Some of them actually did take off and land from the Intrepid, and others were just really lucky to have right now in our collection too, and we do like to talk about them. So I'm going to highlight two more of those before we wrap up for today. The first one is this one. So this long black one here is called the Lockheed A12. Now, it is commonly confused with the SR-71, the Blackbird, but you can kind of think of this one like its big brother. So during the 1960s, kind of Cold War era, it was a CIA spy plane, and it was the fastest plane ever built. At top speeds, it could go Mach 3. So that is 3 times faster than the speed of sound. That is over 2,100 miles per hour. And it could actually go so fast that it could fly from Washington, D.C. to California in just over an hour. And that trip normally takes about 5 hours. Now, if you really look at it, you can also start to see why it could go so fast. So it has that very sleek, streamlined design. There, obviously isn't going to be a lot of friction or drag against it as the air is moving over to slow it down. And you can also really see how big those jet intakes are. Those things with the round red ring around it, those things are massive. And so it's able to take in just a ton of air at a time. And those giant pointy cones that are inside of them even further helps to cut down on the air resistance that it might run into. So it can just suck in that air so much faster and go so much faster. And the same thing with that pointy needle in the front of the nose there. Everything about this plane was just designed to help it go fast. And not only did it go fast, it also went really high too. So its peak altitude was about 85,000 feet. And that's actually so high that the pilot inside of it had to wear a pressurized suit, just like the astronauts during the space race. But remember, everyone, it was a spy plane too. The government designed this plane specifically to spy on the Soviet Union. And they were incredibly advanced with their technologies back then, including the use actually of titanium to build it. And funny story about that too. The problem was that the titanium was so new at the time, their supplier only had a very limited amount of it. So the CIA did this worldwide search in order to find more titanium, and they started using fake companies to buy up little by little where they could. Because again, it's the CIA, they had to be really secretive. But the majority of the places that they found it was in the Soviet Union. So ironically, there they were helping us to build the very thing that would let us spy on them too. So as a spy plane, though, of course, it does have some super strong cameras. And there's a camera that's so powerful that I have heard that if you flipped a coin while it's flying over you, it could take a picture of the coin down at the ground and would be able to tell if it landed on heads or tails. So very, very strong camera on that too. And Jeffrey, I see, did it land on the Intrepid? No, it did not land on the Intrepid. Unfortunately, no. This was a little bit this was a little more secretive at the time. They didn't want to brag about the fact that they had this one at the time. So this is a decommissioned one. The CIA was very nice to let us display it. But no, this was brought on using a crane. It did not land on the Intrepid. Great question, though. There were actually only 15 of these ever built. So they were also, using them. So they didn't need to be landing on the aircraft carriers. But only 9 of them are still around today. So we are actually very, very lucky to have this one on display. So come by and see it. And lastly, I kind of have been teasing this along the way. Lastly, I would like to highlight this last plane. So this is the fastest commercial jet ever made. This is the Concorde. Now, it flew from 1976 to 2003, and it could fly at Mach 2. So not quite as fast as the A12, but still really, really, really fast at twice the speed of sound. So again, though, we can notice the shape of this plane, right? It's very, very streamlined. It's very, very sleek, and it can go super, super fast too. It can go about 1,400 miles per hour, and it made the 7-hour flight from New York City all the way across the ocean to London in just about 3 hours. Now, the Concorde it's a very fabled plane. Many people have heard of this. It is the peak of luxury. It could hold 100 people, and the passengers ate Michelin-starred cuisine while they were in the air. They ate things like Angus beef and smoked salmon, and caviar and lobster and truffles and foie gras, and they drank champagne. Very, very fancy. Unfortunately, due to rising costs and decreasing demand and also some safety concerns, they discontinued use of the Concorde in 2003. But visitors to the Intrepid sometimes do have the unique opportunity to take a look inside of our cabin here. And we have a number of other really, really cool artifacts to help to bring it to life too. Now, all of this is to say, everyone, that even from home, you all can get a very special peek into our museum and into the Concorde using this thing called Google Arts and Culture. You can use this on your phone or you can use this on a computer. All you have to do is search for Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum on Google Arts and Culture. Just look, Google Arts and Culture. And there you can actually stroll through a number of the different areas of the ship, the mess deck, the hangar deck, up on the flight deck, the space shuttle pavilion that you just saw, and also through the Concorde, and even our submarine growler too. That feature is really cool. It's kind of like Google Street View. So you can browse around at your own pace and zoom in and walk through all of the areas, even actually up in the CIC area, which is where they have a lot of communication stuff. So definitely check that out. There's also some online exhibits that you can see. There's also a feature on that cakes exhibit too that I mentioned, and just some artifacts on there that you can learn about and read through as well. The museum also launched recently some access to our archives. We have a new system that you can look up some of the really great artifacts that we have as well through our website, intrepidmuseum.org. So you can pop on there and check those out too. So everyone, that concludes our Intrepid Highlights tour for today, showing off some of my favorite things at the museum. But I do want to see if there are any final questions as we wrap up for the day. Any last burning questions from anyone? Any questions? Great. How many people were on the Intrepid? So there were about 3,000 people, 3,000 sailors that served on board at any time. And they all had very different jobs, of course. So they each were doing very, very important things like launching planes or flying planes or lifting and lowering anchors or baking those massive cakes. And they all really had to work together. They were at sea for about 6 to 9 months at a time. So you can imagine, they're leaving their families and their friends, their loved ones back home, but they were kind of creating a new family on board the ship together while they were all working together to, get through this very difficult time while they were there. So, yeah, a lot of people, about 3,000 men at any given time. All right. Any other questions? Any last questions before we wrap up? No? Oh, how can you differentiate the A12 from the SR-71? So I believe the differences is the maximum speed and the maximum height. They look very similar, but it has to do with the power that it can generate, and it has to do with the maximum height that it can fly up to. And how fast it can go. So the A12 was fastest, and so the SR-71, I like to say, is kind of like its younger brother, but like it's not a kid brother. It's like still really awesome and powerful. But they do commonly get mixed up because they look very, very similar. The SR-71's nickname was the Blackbird, and the A12 nickname was the Oxcart, Project Oxcart. But both very secretive, both very, very super cool spy planes as well. All right, my friends. Well, if you have any other questions about our programs, you can feel free to reach out to us through our website, intrepidmuseum.org, or also through any of our social media outlets. And I would like to thank you all so much for watching and sharing your comments with me today. The museum, of course, has introduced a number of these new live streams, so feel free to follow and subscribe to this channel that you're watching now, or visit our website for the latest streaming schedule. And if you're able, your donations of any amount will help to keep our programs free or low cost. And you can also explore becoming a member online as well. I also do want to mention, I think I might have mentioned this earlier, but I'll mention it again. Our museum just reopened to the public last week, and so we would love to see you in person. We are now open Thursdays through Sundays from 10 to 5 p.m. So if you are in the area or, just passing through this way, please do stop on by. You will be able to explore all of these really amazing artifacts in person, get to see the space shuttle. You can check out the submarine. You can see all of the really cool things in the cake exhibit too. So, all right, my friends, thank you again so much for joining us today. And we would love to see you for an upcoming program. So stay tuned and we will see you next time. Bye, everyone. Got like 1,000 emails.